Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being with us today, and welcome to Florida Climate Week. My name is Dawn Sheriffs. I'm the Florida Director for the Environmental Defense Fund. And today I'm thrilled to have a conversation with Miami-Dade's Chief Resilient Officer, Loren Parra, to talk a little bit about how we strengthen at-risk communities in Miami-Dade County and look at really what the landscape and changing landscape is for Florida and building resilience. Loren, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Dawn.
So, it's been a minute since Miami-Dade really emerged as the early leader on resilience. I wouldn't even just say in Florida, I would say nationally. The first resilience officer, if I remember correctly, was appointed in 2015. So we're about 10 years deep into this journey. What would you share are the largest lessons about building resilience over the last decade?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to always take a step back and really just acknowledge how we got here. And I think for a community as diverse as Miami-Dade, it's always helpful to remember that it was our previous mayor, Mayor Carlos Jimenez, who is now a congressional member for the Miami-Dade delegation, who actually took the bold step of hiring the first chief resiliency officer. And so just remembering that this has really been a bipartisan effort over the past 10 years. And just reminding our residents that when we talk about resilience, we're really talking about meeting people's lived experience. And so if that is increased flooding in your neighborhood, or if that is exposure to extreme heat, that's what we're talking about when we talk about resilience. And so I think acknowledging that that lived experience is at the center of all of this work has been really important for building coalitions across Miami-Dade.
Yeah, it's really important. We've seen a fair bit of polling that continues to showcase in Miami-Dade and in Florida that building resilience is just not a partisan issue. This is one of those values that because we're experiencing the impacts firsthand, we all feel the urgent need to address it. And the risks really are changing. And I think that's what's been so startling. I think communities coming from the perspective of Pinellas County, and we had two really difficult back-to-back hurricanes last year, and the community would sort of repeatedly say, I didn't think it would flood. It's never flooded. My home has never flooded before. And we're now at that moment where we can no longer look backward to risk information. It's been a difficult thing to sort of make sure everybody understands and they can plan accordingly. How would you characterize your community's shift in risk evolving over the last decade?
Yeah, I think for us, just a huge challenge has been aging infrastructure and the increased risk that comes along with aging septic tanks or older bridges and transit infrastructure. We know that those are massive investments that we need to prioritize, but they take a really long time to be able to fully fund, to plan, to design, to construct. And so everywhere we can, we're trying to build physical resiliency into our infrastructure, but we know that issues like our septic to sewer transition, those are deeply tied to available funding. And so we're trying our best to prioritize the most vulnerable areas, but we know that that's something that the community really wants. People don't want to be on a leaky, smelly septic tank. They want to be able to connect to sewer. But that's an expensive challenge. And so I think for us, trying to figure out and cobble together all of the funding, that's not specific to Miami-Dade, of course. We know that every other city municipality is, facing the same challenges, but that's really been a huge one for us as far as really assessing the changing risk over the past 10 years as well.
And it's difficult. Those are huge ticket items for dollar amounts. But it also remains true, I think it's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that did the analysis that for every dollar spent in resilience building, you really get a $6 return on investment, which is, really, it's difficult in the moment when budgets feel tight, but really does pay off later. So of the projects that the county has been able to move over time, what would you say is the most successful?
That's a tough question. I think we've had, of course, lots of successes that are worth touting. Again, our septic to sewer transition, we've had really great investments and a strong partner in the state of Florida. FDEP has really helped us with speeding along that process. But outside of that, we've electrified a really big part of the county fleet, not only all of the service vehicles that our county employees use, but we also have one of the largest electric fleets of public buses in the country. And so we're really proud of that. We have what I have heard described as the country's most resilient airport. And so making sure that our shuttles are either electric or running on CNG, not necessarily diesel powered, making sure that all of our new terminals have solar panels on them, and working really closely with FPL through a master services agreement to ensure that we have some energy independence so that we can get back online after a hurricane quicker than we would be without a little bit of extra juice at the site. So we've made a lot of investments over the past 10 years. And recently, we actually received a $3 million tax credit return from the federal government because of all of those investments that we've made across Miami-Dade County.
That's great. Yeah, we've worked quite a bit on the cost benefits around electrification of transportation fleets. And, we just consistently find that the math adds up. It is lower cost over the life of the ownership of the vehicle, less maintenance, all that stuff. And it really does save ratepayers money. And that's just, and taxpayers money. It's a really good win-win solution, especially in a community that has so much access to sunshine and renewable power that can really fuel these vehicles. So excited to hear the great work that you guys have done. What were the efforts that maybe didn't go as planned? Any snags?
Well, I think that what has always been a unique challenge, but continues to be, an area for opportunity is our governance structure here in Miami-Dade. So we have a strong county government that provides critical services to about 3 million people. That includes fire rescue, water and sewer, until recently our police department and public safety. But we also have 34 individual cities and municipalities, each with their own mayors, their own town councils. And so working to improve resiliency through legislation, through policy, that's difficult when you're dealing with 34 individual town councils. Of course, we have a strong partnership through the Resilient 305 with the city of Miami and the city of Miami Beach, two of our biggest cities. And so that work continues, but it's always both a challenge and an opportunity to figure out ways to work with and bring along all of our smaller cities who oftentimes are experiencing flooding on a very real, repetitive basis, but maybe don't have the funding to be able to make improvements at the pace that they'd like. And so we're always trying to figure out ways to work with our cities and munis, because lots of times they're truly the front lines between people and that lived experience that we keep talking about.
Yeah, it's a lot of different stakeholders to juggle. And I think, you mentioned the Resilient 305 strategy. For those who haven't been read into that, the Resilient 305 effort was a multi-year planning initiative that really laid out a path forward for the county to strengthen it. But it had a lot of stakeholders at the table, and I would say a good number of cities' goals and concerns were reflected in that plan as well. So I'm glad to hear that partnership continues. How do you think the role of the Chief Resilience Officer has changed?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I think that the Chief Resilience Officer and their responsibility, I think, to the community stays the same at its core. Again, it's really about listening to residents and identifying those key lived experiences for us to be able to try and provide solutions. But certainly in a changing political landscape, our ability to communicate the value of this work, depending on who is in power, is critical. I cannot stress that enough. When we started a lot of this work, we had very, very active bipartisan support, but certainly a changing federal landscape, changing political discussions. We just need to be responsive and we need to be listening to residents to make sure that we're always using the type of language that helps them understand why the work that we're doing is important.
Yeah, I think this year there's been a lot of shifts, right? We're seeing for the first time the amount of money available in Florida's Resilient Grant Trust Fund was reduced. And, for years it's been at the $200 million level. But there's over $2 billion in requested projects coming from communities like yours that aren't getting funded right now. And then on top of that, we saw the federal government eliminating the BRIC program. That was about $150 million impact to projects that the South Florida Water Management District would have been doing in the region. And unfortunately, the need is not going down. And so how do we navigate these new funding challenges and make sure that folks really understand the benefit and the storytelling piece of that? Because projects on a spreadsheet is one thing, but there's really truly lives at stake. And we've got to make sure that these pieces move. In thinking about that, what do you see as helpful from the Florida legislature or the federal government or other partners to kind of help accelerate this work so that we can meet the need?
Yeah, so I think any time that our state legislators come down to the districts and see the projects that we're talking about, there's always this click moment of, oh, I see this, I understand this, I'm touching it. I am so much better positioned to actually advocate for this when I'm in Tallahassee. So whether it's bringing down our delegation and doing a tour of Biscayne Bay, or bringing folks down and having them see the raising of the road that we did that now includes French Wells, right? And so making sure that an emergency evacuation route is not only effective, but also resilient, making sure that our legislators can see and touch and feel those projects has been really effective for us. So I think for us, one of those big ones was seeing changes to the Resilient Florida program that helps some of the grading be tied to CRS ratings, which is a national flood reduction program. And so we're on our end making huge investments to ensure that a lot of our infrastructure is, again, reducing flooding. And so when we see that the state is willing to count those types of investments towards their grant program, that really helps all of us so that we're compounding those benefits and unlocking additional funds.
Yeah, and once again, I mean, the data really supports that type of work. We know that when we use traditional infrastructure like just flood walls alone, we don't get the cost benefit of having them combined with nature-based features. And so you're really making a more affordable upfront investment that has longer term benefits over the long haul. And so I think it's been great that the state really has recognized that and baked it into their process. There was, interestingly, a report about how more and more insurers are starting to understand how these risk prevention strategies can provide for some cost savings, because we are really making a difference in what's available. We sometimes have the conversation amongst folks that work in the political realm that people don't necessarily think that climate change exists. And polling doesn't necessarily agree with that, but certainly neither do the private sector, right? The folks that are predicting markets, that are setting prices for fossil fuels, for insurance. I mean, those folks have been calculating the changing climate risks for generations at this point. And so I'm really curious how you see the private sector in Miami-Dade's community showing up around building resilience.
Yeah, I think for us, relying on a strong voice across the private sector has been just part of the strategy. And so I think for us, case studies like the federal Back Bay study, where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is looking to protect really vulnerable communities from coastal storm surge, we had a really loud contingency of private developers who engaged on that project and basically were standing side by side with the county, with advocacy groups, with residents to say, we are not a community that will accept a big gray wall across our coastline. And so making sure that we can build those bridges with private developers, with real estate agents, with residents. The private sector has a huge role to play in all of this because at the end of the day, for Miami-Dade, the bulk of our coastline is privately owned. And so making sure that those owners, those landowners are in the discussion and helping us push for the type of nature-based solutions that we all want to see has been incredibly, incredibly effective.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to hear that because we've had conversations over the years with individual developers who maybe started out saying like, well, I can just raise, the elevation of this particular property that I'm looking to develop. And the problem is water doesn't respect your property boundaries. Water likes to then say shift to your neighbors, right? And so we really can't build comprehensive resilience in that kind of an ad hoc manner. This isn't one of those places where, we can just take care of ourselves. It really requires that everybody in the community. And so I'm glad to see that they're really stepping up and taking the lead. I think we're seeing some of those shifts happening across the state. But certainly I think it happened in Miami-Dade first. So what does success look like in 10 years from now when we're having this conversation with you or your successor?
Yeah, I think there's probably several ways that we can answer that. I think here at the county, oftentimes we just, think through, are all of our residents able to live with all of these changing environmental factors? And so are our residents able to get around this community in spite of additional water that's coming into our communities? Are our residents able to get around on public transit in the face of extreme heat and increased weather? Those are the everyday challenges that we're really trying to respond to. And so again, making sure that our residents who are here are able to live and thrive and be successful safely in the face of a very, very different and changing climate for us is really what success looks like.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I think we think about resilience as bouncing back from lots of different stressors that are happening in communities and showing up in different ways. What's one thing you would want every policymaker to understand about this work?
Especially in times of shrinking budgets, of financial challenges, oftentimes we see folks deciding that resiliency is a nice to have. And what we know from lived experience, from decades of doing this work, resilience isn't a nice to have. It's not a cherry on top. It is really about the infrastructure that we're providing to our residents. These are critical services. This is about safety, public health. Investments in resilience aren't just a nice to have that we can consider slashing during difficult times, but instead, those are the moments where we should be doubling down on resiliency more than ever. And so I think for us, just sharing with our legislators, our lawmakers, our policymakers that resiliency is really a critical function is probably one of the most important lessons that we can leave them.
No small task ahead, and you've been very generous with your time, but I have to tell you that the Environmental Defense Fund is thrilled with the work that you and your team are doing. Continue to offer our support in any way we can, and thanks for joining Florida Climate Week.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you all for the work that you do and for keeping this effort alive statewide. We're just a small part of the state, but we're happy to always share and celebrate all the wins across South Florida and beyond.
You know what they say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.